Now, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Max Tarjan. She is our Waterbird Program Director at SFBBO. She received her bachelor's in ecology and evolutionary biology at Princeton, and then she came all the way over here to the West Coast to do her master's and PhD at UC Santa Cruz in behavioral ecology. She studied space use and reproductive success of male sea otters in Monterey Bay while she was there. Max is really interested in space use by wildlife, and here at SFBBO, she uses spatial statistics and programming to track bird populations and to help inform wildlife management in the Bay Area. So now I am going to hand it over to Max.
Thank you everyone for joining me today for this talk. I'm going to be reviewing some of our work on phalaropes today. So I'm going to start with the basics. We in the San Francisco Bay Area have 3 species of phalaropes. They're medium-sized shorebirds. This is one of the species, the red-necked phalarope. You might wonder, where is its red neck? If you see it in San Francisco Bay, you're likely to see it looking like this, but during the breeding season, you get the red neck on the red-necked phalarope. One of the characteristics that you can key into for distinguishing the 3 different species that we have is the eye stripe. So you can see in the white and gray plumage, in the wintering plumage, that this one has a long eye stripe and it droops down at the end. So that's something to look out for if you're trying to identify your phalaropes. The next species we have is the Wilson's phalarope. You can see there's very little eye stripe here, and you have on the left the wintering plumage, so that's mostly what you'd see in the Bay Area, and then on the right the breeding plumage. And then finally are the red phalarope. You can see in the San Francisco Bay Area they have the black eye stripe, so that's much more straight, and then you can also see the bill is significantly shorter than the other species, and then on the right they're pretty much all red during their breeding plumage. Interestingly, in Europe I found out this is actually called the gray phalarope. They must be getting them over there during their wintering plumage and not their breeding, since they are red during the breeding season. So those are our 3 phalaropes. The reason I say that they're shorebirds that avoid the shore is because they feed on small aquatic invertebrates and also flying aquatic insects. And this species of shorebird feeds almost exclusively in water. So there aren't a lot of shorebirds that spend a lot of time swimming, but this is one of those species where you're mostly going to see it swimming in the water. They're kind of notorious for their feeding behavior, where they spin in the water while feeding. This is a really cool behavior where they spin very quickly and they kick the surface water away from their axis of rotation. And removing that water allows deeper water to come up to replace the surface water. So it causes essentially a small upwelling event, and they generate this force to up to ½ a meter. And what that does is it can bring some of these aquatic invertebrates up to the surface and concentrate them, and it helps the birds to concentrate their prey for eating. One of the interesting facts that I found about this feeding behavior is that phalaropes do have handedness, and by that I mean an individual will only spin in one direction. So either it's a bird that spins counterclockwise or they'll spin clockwise. And I'm going to show you a couple of videos of this behavior because it's quite interesting to watch. So this is 3 Wilson's phalarope foraging. So you can see that we have 2 spinners in one direction and one of the birds is spinning the opposite direction, and they will continue to always do that. As I said, the leading hypothesis for this behavior is that birds use this behavior to bring prey up to the surface of the water so that they can eat it. I also came across this video of a confused Wilson's phalarope that's using the spinning behavior, but it's actually using it on land, which is relatively kind of an interesting thing to watch. This one's a little confused. It's continuing to use that. It's probably feeding on some of those adult insects instead. These videos are not sped up. They're at regular speed, so they are quite fast in their movements there. You can see some other shorebird species passing through in the background. Sort of mesmerizing. So in terms of their conservation status, there's not a whole lot of information known about phalarope populations. There have been some local declines seen. They are not currently listed as endangered. However, because of some of these local declines, in the past couple of years, a group has formed called the International Phalarope Working Group, and they convened in 2019 and reviewed the state of the information on phalaropes and came up with some information about their conservation status. From their report, one thing they said is that a major issue is lack of data on the status of phalaropes. Collecting data on population and trends throughout their range was identified as a pressing need. So while they're not currently listed, a lot of researchers in phalaropes think that's just because we have a lack of information about population trends. The group also identified a pressing need, that's that declining water levels at salt lakes on phalaropes' migratory routes is also a key threat. So why are the salt lakes important? During migration, phalaropes feed, as I said, mostly on the water. So the species differ a bit in their habitat preferences. During migration, red phalaropes are mostly seen offshore and they're unlikely to appear inland. So during the migration routes, you're most likely to see red phalaropes, especially in the Bay Area, if you take a boat out of the bay and out into the ocean. That's really where you encounter your red phalaropes. On the other hand, Wilson's and red-necked phalaropes will forage in open water areas that are inland. So they are definitely subject to any changes in especially these salt pond habitats that have the prey that they prefer, and natural salt ponds are predicted and currently declining due to climate change. So looking at those two species that we're likely to see in the San Francisco Bay Area, because again, they do forage inland, the red-necked phalarope and Wilson's phalarope, the phalaropes are distributed worldwide. So these are the distributions in the Americas. You can see the breeding range is in the pink, the non-breeding areas are in blue, and then the migration routes are in yellow. So you can see that Wilson's phalarope do migrate much farther. And then if you just look in at the area in California, San Francisco Bay, red-necked phalaropes have San Francisco Bay really sort of in the middle of their migration routes. If you look at Wilson's phalarope, some of those birds actually breed at latitudes as far south as San Francisco Bay. So a lot of those birds probably aren't passing through the bay. You can see that the migratory range just kind of includes San Francisco Bay, and it's really at the edge of the Wilson's phalarope migratory route. And that will come into play once we look at some of the data about looking at phalarope use of San Francisco Bay. So when we talk about San Francisco Bay, what is the available habitat of interest? So the bay is a very large estuary. It used to have a lot of tidal salt marsh all around the fringes. However, for the last about 150 years, there's been a lot of salt production that's happened. So that tidal marsh was converted to salt production ponds. And in particular, in South San Francisco Bay, there are a very large number of these ponds that were used for salt production. So I'm going to zoom in on South San Francisco Bay. You can see all of these colored ponds were for about 150 years used to produce commercial salt. About a decade ago, the salt production company became more efficient in their practices, so they were able to give the land or sell the lands to some land managers. So the blue portion is now owned by California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and all of the green ponds are owned by the Don Edwards Reserve, which is U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And these sites are now part of the largest wetland tidal marsh habitat restoration project on the West Coast. So they were commercial salt production ponds, and now they're getting converted to tidal marsh, which is what they used to be 150 years ago. So what does that kind of mean? The goal is to go from these salt production ponds that look like this. They can be amazing colors. They have all kinds of interesting algae that grow in them because of the very high salinity. To restore them, the managers breach the levees, so they basically bulldoze a hole in the levee to open up the pond to tidal action. So the bay waters are able to come in and out of the ponds. Initially, that turns into mudflat, like you see here. So there's not vegetation yet, but it is open to tidal action. Ideally, the bay brings sediment into the area, so you get the sediment accumulating. Eventually, there's marsh plant growth, so it becomes a marshy area, and that supports a lot of different species, including many species of shorebirds, as well as some endangered and threatened species, including the salt marsh harvest mouse and the ridgeway rail in South San Francisco Bay. So this is restoring historical habitat and has a lot of benefits for many species. However, for phalaropes in particular, they do not use this tidal marsh habitat. They really prefer these salty ponds. So when you do this conversion, the phalaropes are actually losing habitat in San Francisco Bay. And there has been some evidence that there has actually been a decline in use by phalaropes as this restoration has occurred. So these are some data that were collected by SFBBO and also USGS, and it shows the number of phalaropes that were counted over time in this restoration area. So in the salt ponds, and then in the ponds that are either restored or being managed for other wildlife like waterfowl. So if we look at the timeline, around 2007 was when the restoration project activities really took off. So you can see in that period before, there were a lot of pretty high counts of phalaropes observed. The dotted line that goes across is the average number of phalaropes observed in those early years. And then you can see that there's really a decline in numbers, and since the project started, there have been much lower counts. So this suggests that we might have seen a decline in phalaropes in conjunction with this move towards restoring tidal marsh. However, really weren't designed to capture phalaropes. They were designed to capture a lot of other migratory birds, so they're really not timed well to count phalaropes. So while we do see this decline, the numbers that we see here are definitely an underestimate of phalaropes, and we wanted to really be able to get a better handle on phalarope use of the bay and also what the trends look like over time. Right now, the project is in the beginning of its second decade. It is a 50-year trajectory, so it's still in the very early stages relative to the change that's going to come. So the goals that we had were to count the population of migratory phalaropes in South San Francisco Bay. And there are two motivations for this. One is that we can contribute to flyway-wide estimates of phalarope populations. And then also more locally, we want to track trends in the local phalarope populations as this restoration progresses. So to meet that goal, one of the sets of questions is, how do we design a survey that can count the local population of migratory phalaropes? And at the very basic level, we want to answer the questions of where do we look for phalaropes, when do we look for them, and there are two components of that. So one is during what range of dates are we going to go look for phalaropes, and another is during that range of dates, how many times do we have to go out and count phalaropes to get a good idea of their population size. So like I said, the data set that we currently have available is pretty limited for phalaropes. So to supplement that, I turned to citizen science observations on eBird. If you haven't used eBird before, it's a website and mobile application where bird watchers can submit what are called checklists, and those show the count of bird species by location and date. If you're interested in this, Barbara Call is an SFBBO volunteer, and she gave a whole Birdie Hour talk about this last month, about all of the uses and how it works. So I will refer you to her talk to learn more about it. The result of this application is that there's what is called the eBird basic data set, and that is a 4 GB text file, and it has over 100 million records or 100 million checklists. So that's worldwide data. It's a huge file. Took a couple of days for me to download. So once I spent those couple days downloading the file, I was able to subset that massive amount of data to select the information that I wanted, which was information on phalaropes in South San Francisco Bay. So once I did that, I found that there were 730 checklists with red-necked phalaropes and 569 checklists with Wilson's phalaropes from the period of January 2006 to May 2019. And eBird is relatively new. I was really able to find enough records to start getting an idea of phalarope presence starting in around 2006. So prior to that, there's a lot less data. So the first question I wanted to answer using the data was, where should we survey for phalaropes? So I took the eBird observations and I put them on a map, and all of these polygons outlined in blacks are those ponds. So they're either current salt production ponds or they're ponds that are a part of this restoration project. And I was able to see that a lot of these phalarope observations do fall within the project area. There are some outside of it, but I was able to get a very good handle on where these species were observed, and it's split by species. So tricolor is the Wilson's phalarope on the right, and then on the left you have red-necked phalarope. And the size of the circles here just shows the number of phalaropes that were observed at that location. So this gives me a pretty good idea of where to look. The next question was, when should we survey? So this plot shows the number of phalaropes observed based on the date, and then it's split up into years. So the first panel on the top is 2006. That's when I first started looking at the data. And then it goes all the way down to 2019. So I only went through May 2019. So you can see it just shows the spring migration period. So one of the things that stood out to me, again, this is broken up by species. In this one, the red-necked phalarope are in the pink. So think of the red neck goes with the pink, and then Wilson's phalarope are in blue. So when phalaropes are migrating, they have a spring migration and then a winter migration. One of the things that I noticed from looking at the observations with date was that Wilson's phalarope are really not observed in San Francisco Bay in the spring. So what that means is that those birds are actually taking a different migration route in their spring migration compared to their fall migration. So that was kind of interesting. It also told me that if I want to maximize surveys and look for both species, I probably shouldn't look at the spring migration. I should focus more on the fall migration. So I combined the data across years to ask the question of what dates in the fall should I actually be looking for phalaropes. So this plot shows all of those years combined. And again, in the blue, you have Wilson's phalarope observations and counts, and then in the pink, you have the red-necked phalarope observations and counts. So one thing that I noticed is that phalaropes are abundant for a pretty long period during the fall migration. So they're observed in high numbers from July through September. The Wilson's phalarope also peaked much earlier, so they peaked on July 14th, whereas the red-necked phalarope peaked on September 5th, much later in the season. So there's a really large spread, and then there's also a big difference between the two species. So it turned out that there really wasn't a way to do, a single survey or set that would capture the peak for both of the species. It really had to be some kind of repeated survey. So with the timing question, I had to know how many times should we survey. So I'm just going to walk through some kind of logical thinking about how you might count birds at different stages of their life. So birds that are either on the wintering grounds, so somewhere they're foraging, or on the breeding grounds where they're pretty stationary and breeding, most of those birds will be on either the wintering grounds or the breeding grounds. They'll all be there at the same time at the peak. So, once it's the peak breeding season, you'll have most of your birds. So what that means is that you can go out on a given date, maybe 1 or 2 times, and you can do 1 or 2 counts and get a pretty good estimate of the whole population. Now, for migratory sites, it's pretty different. Birds start their migration at different times, and they arrive at a migratory stopover site at different times. So, for example, San Francisco Bay is a migratory stopover site. So some of the birds might have, they differ in age and sex, and also their behavior. Maybe some of them had nest failures, maybe some of them had 2 clutches of eggs. So they're arriving at different times. So what this means is that you really need to count birds at a migratory stopover site multiple times throughout the migration to know how many birds are relying on the area as a stopover site. So if you think about this, we saw that the phalaropes they're present from July through September, but any given individual is not around that entire time. We actually don't know how long an individual bird uses San Francisco Bay. So I looked in the literature and found that at other sites, the stopover time is about 2 weeks for phalaropes at migratory sites. So if you think about that, you have this very prolonged migration period. So if you go out, July 1st and you count, and then you count on July 15th, the July 15th group is probably a whole different set of birds. And then similarly, August 1st, you're going to get a whole different set of birds. So you really do need to count repetitively to know how many total birds are using the area. So the survey strategy is generally that your survey frequency, or how frequently you survey, should be equal to the turnover rate, which is just how long on average an individual bird stays in the area. So like I said, based on other sites, I estimated that it's about 2 weeks. However, we don't really know what it is for San Francisco Bay, so that's definitely room for future research. So based on this information, I was able to come up with a survey plan for phalaropes. I selected 29 sites where most of the historical phalaropes have been observed, determined that we should be surveying from July through September, and then also that surveys at each site should occur every 2 weeks. So that leads to 7 surveys per year. And that sounds like a lot, but remember that you're getting different individuals every time you survey, and there's probably a different number of individuals each time. So this is the plan where SFBBO is going to execute this year. Obviously, volunteer involvement is somewhat contingent on the shelter in place. However, hopefully by September, people will be able to do some of these outdoor activities, especially the solo surveys. So please sign up to volunteer, because I'm going to be putting out a call for volunteers sometime this month. And so that you know what kind of information we get from this, we did do a pilot study in 2019. So I came up with the survey plan, and then scrambled in early August to get some volunteers involved to help do a survey. We were able to get out 2 times, so the first survey started on August 15th and then 2 weeks later on August 26th. And last year we had 14 staff and volunteers participate. So the 2 maps that you see show the first date and then the second date and where we observe phalaropes. Again, the size of the circle shows how many phalaropes were counted at that site. And you can see that there are a lot of blue dots where we saw phalaropes, and then there are also a lot of black dots on sites. The black dots are locations that were surveyed that had 0 phalaropes. So we went there and there weren't any phalaropes using the site that day. So the interesting takeaway from last year's pilot was that there were not very many sites where we saw phalaropes each time we went. They tend to move around a lot and use different areas. And again, it's probably a different set of birds, but it's not very predictable on a given survey where you're going to find them. So it's really critical to survey all of them. But as a volunteer, what you might expect if you went out for up to 7 surveys is sometimes you're going to go and there will be no phalaropes, but that's really important for us to know. And then sometimes you might go and there might be 600. So they are definitely changing their locations throughout the season. If you look at the bar graph on the bottom right, those are the counts that we achieved during those 2 surveys. And as we expected, so remember that Wilson's phalarope come much earlier in the season, so they're really abundant in July. So Wilson's phalarope are in the green. There were much fewer of them, but we had a lot of red-necked phalarope that we observed in blue. So we had 2,500 red-necked phalarope across those 2 survey periods and about 400 Wilsons, and then 11 phalaropes that were too far to identify, but our identification was very high for the groups. So takeaway points, phalaropes are medium-sized shorebirds that forage in water. There is little information about their populations, and that is concerning because they're declining in some areas and they're vulnerable to habitat loss as a result of climate change. Data collected by citizen scientists help researchers to plan where and when to survey phalaropes for an accurate count of the population at migratory sites. And once these targeted surveys are planned, citizen scientists can help with those too. And we now know to look for phalaropes from July to September. We know to expect Wilson's phalaropes earlier. And in South San Francisco Bay, we're most likely to see them at these managed wetlands, managed sites. So I wanted to thank our funders for this work and collaborators, and then also all of the landowners who gave us and our volunteers access. And then I was gonna show you another of these mesmerizing foraging videos just because they're pretty fantastic while you all think of questions. This is not sped up. This is the actual speed of the spinning. I thought it was sped up initially, but they're pretty impressive making that small upwelling event. So thank you so much. I'm gonna hand the screen over to Serena.
So the first question is from Laura. She asked, what is the ratio of left-handed and right-handed phalaropes? Is it similar to that of people? And does this cause personality differences like they do in people?
That's a great question. The first account that I read, or the earliest account that was written about this spinning behavior, said that the phalaropes only spin counterclockwise. And then later there were studies on captive phalaropes that found that they actually do spin in both directions, but that it depends on the individual. So I don't know what the ratio is, but based on that first account, I would assume that probably the majority spin counterclockwise, or at least wherever that researcher was. And I do not know of any work about whether that correlates with any other personality traits.
Sarah asked, will there be more focus on conducting thorough counts of phalaropes in the coming years? And it sounds like most of your talk was about that, but feel free to elaborate.
Yeah, definitely. I think with the International Phalarope Working Group starting up, their first meeting was in 2019, and I've just started coordinating with them. They're doing surveys at Mono Lake and others of these really major stopover sites that are farther inland in salt ponds. Like I said, San Francisco Bay is, especially for Wilson's phalarope, really far on the edge of their migration range. So relative to some other sites, in particular Mono Lake, we do get a lot fewer of them. Nevertheless, because those lakes are declining in size and habitat availability, I think it's still important for the Bay to be supporting the species. But yes, so with the formation of that group and the interest, I think everyone's doing a lot more to try to coordinate surveys and get a better handle on population sizes overall and also trends through time. So I think we're going to see a lot more research going towards that.
Christina asked, or Christina says, I work at Coyote Hills in Fremont, where the salt ponds are. Should I be on the lookout for them?
Yeah, definitely. Now that I've been out talking about this, get emails from people that say, oh, I noticed phalarope showing up. So I've actually gotten a couple of reports of, the spring migration from some of our staff that are in the fields. But yeah, it's always useful to know when they're out there. Also, I plan on continuing to pull from the eBird data set to inform our timing and just make sure it continues to align. So if you are someone that knows how to use eBird and you do observe phalaropes, it's great to add it there because that is publicly accessible and researchers like myself and anyone else who wants to find it can pull that information at any time.
Judy asked, do the red-necked phalaropes have lobate feet based on their scientific name? And Sarah responded that they do have lobed toes. Is there anything else you want to add?
Yeah, they do have lobed toes, and it's really, they spend so much more of their time swimming than other shorebirds, and especially because it's a mechanism for foraging for them. I'm sure there's been some, evolutionary pressure to make that upwelling, that small upwelling vortex. So like I said, they do generate a pretty strong force to concentrate prey, so I'm sure the lobing helps with that.
Jan asked, can you say anything comparing migration through the San Francisco Bay compared to the numbers and timing of phalaropes in Mono Lake and other Great Basin lakes?
Yeah, I don't know that people have compared the timing. What we're going to try to do for the surveys is coordinate so that people surveying at every site are doing it at the same time. And that will tell us, I'll have one set of phalaropes in San Francisco Bay. Mono Lake will have a separate set since we're surveying ideally on the same day, but definitely in the same week period. Given the migration routes, usually the sites that are at similar latitude should be getting them around the same time, and that's sort of what I've been seeing in other people's data. So yeah, I think once we have those coordinated surveys, we'll know a lot more about that. But like I said, in terms of numbers, San Francisco Bay, because it's more on the edge of the migration range for those two species, tends to get fewer of them than somewhere like Mono Lake or some of the more inland lakes.
Jan also asked, do you think there were any phalaropes migrating through prior to introduction of salt ponds?
That's an excellent question. So certainly red phalaropes are all out in the open ocean, and there are a lot of eBird observations that obviously follow basically where the boats go, so right out of the bay. You can see a lot of observations of red phalaropes out in the ocean. And similarly, I've seen observations farther north in areas that aren't salt ponds. And sometimes we do see phalaropes in some of these kind of muted tidal areas, like New Chicago Marsh. You can find phalaropes there, and that wasn't, as far as I know, wasn't ever a salt pond, but it is kind of muted tidal, so there's water there that they can use at high tide. So it's likely that there were some, but I think given the large decline we saw as soon as the salt production stopped, that there might have been a big increase with the salt production ponds. The other thing to keep in mind too is that the salt production ponds were around for around 150 years, and in that time with climate change, we've probably seen some declines in the inland saline lakes. So it's possible that phalaropes could have, started more heavily using San Francisco Bay, since the habitat here was increasing or get, larger, whereas the more inland habitat has been declining over time and will continue to do so.
Julie asked, what do we know about habitat conditions at phalarope breeding and wintering grounds? How have changes in these habitats affected their populations?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm much less familiar with that, but I do know that one of the main concerns that was identified was at these migratory stopover sites. When they're at the breeding sites, they're on land, they're in kind of grassland areas, and then they can feed on these adult insects. So yeah, I'm less familiar with what's changed in those habitat types, but I do know that in particular the migration sites have been of concern in terms of the impact of climate change on
those. Marianne asked, do they forage and spin at a certain time of day?
That's a great question. Yeah, I don't know if what the pattern is like for that. I mean, I've seen them doing it at all times of day, but I certainly haven't been out at night. So I'm not, I don't know if they decrease that behavior at any point. Like I said, I've observed them doing it throughout the day, but I don't know if there's, overall a change. I suspect, if there's any change in the prey behavior, which for some species there are, then I'm sure the feeding and spinning behavior correlates with how available the prey are. So if the prey change behavior for any reason, then the foraging behavior would respond to. But yeah.
Let's see, Steve asked, have you coordinated studies with Mono Lake? I have observed the spinning behavior there.
Yeah, so we've been, like I said, emailing back and forth and just participating and trying to coordinate all the surveys across, basically through the whole flyway on the West Coast, so that we can be capturing the counts at the same time, and then we're really able to know for certain that, there was one group in SF Bay while there was another group in Mono Lake, so that we can be sure we're not double counting and we can synthesize the data the best. So we're definitely all coordinating around
that. Sarah asked, Sarah says, I know there are plans for the construction of a MODIS tower at Mono Lake. Is there any talk of this happening in the San Francisco Bay as well?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so for some context, MODIS tower it's a radio tower, so it is automatic radio telemetry. So if you put a backpack on a bird, a tiny backpack, that emits a radio signal, what the tower can do is detect that bird when it's in a certain range. So the really cool thing is you don't have to recapture the bird to get the information about where it's been. The idea is you can put the backpack on, the bird can fly, and then wherever it goes near a tower, it will be detected and you get the information. The backpack eventually disintegrates and falls off. but you don't have to actually find it again. Because phalaropes are on the water and they're small, they're very difficult to capture. So this is a pretty good technology to use. So yes, Mono Lake has funding to put in a tower, and they're trying to plan for the putting the back as well. And the motivation there, which I'm also very interested in, is then they can see, for one thing, if birds, how they move between sites, and then also how long they stay at the site. So remember I said that to get an accurate population count, you want to know what the residence time is, or how long a bird is at your site. So that's unknown at San Francisco Bay. I don't think they know at Mono Lake either. That's part of the proposal to put in a tower. So yeah, SFBBO is actually in the very early stages of developing a proposal to put in 3 to 4 towers in San Francisco, or in South San Francisco Bay, for that same purpose. Because we have fewer phalaropes here and they're on the water, I think it would be really difficult to capture them, to put the backpacks on here. So a really good thing to do would be to coordinate with people, in particular at the breeding sites, to have the tags deployed at the breeding sites. And then as the birds fly through San Francisco Bay, then we have the towers to ping the tags to find out that the birds are passing through. So yeah, I've been talking with collaborators at the breeding grounds. They say it's easier to capture the birds because they're in higher concentrations, they can be on land, and also apparently they're very distracted when they're in breeding behavior, so they're much easier to capture with a net. So yeah, I'm trying to coordinate that, and we're definitely interested in getting that set up. The other benefit of Motus towers is that it can serve any species that can wear the backpacks. So we actually have a few other species that we're interested in tracking. One of them is the western snowy plover. So knowing how that species moves around the bay or migrates in and out would also be really useful. So there are multiple benefits to setting that up.
Jeffrey asked, is there a relationship between tidal flow and feeding behavior at San Francisco Bay sites?
Yeah, so, flow. Well, certainly tidal height. So at some of the sites where we find phalaropes, they are tidal. So at low tide, when it's mud flat, you won't find phalaropes there at all. And then you might find them at high tide. So that's certainly something with, restoring tidal marsh. Even in that mud flat phase, you have available phalarope habitat at high tide, but not at low tide. So it still impacts the availability. In terms of flow, I don't know, but my educated guess would be they do like saltier environments, and those environments support their prey better. So my educated guess would be, if you had an area that had less flow, less water exchange, that it might be saltier and therefore support the invertebrates that phalaropes are interested in. But I don't actually know of research on flow in particular. And then there's also, the red phalaropes do great out in the open ocean. So the other research that's been done on the spinning behavior is they tend to do the spinning in more still water. So when there's a lot of water flow, they don't do the spinning as a foraging behavior. And that maybe it's not effective, or maybe there's just already so much movement of prey that it's already being mixed around and brought up. Yeah. So the spinning behavior, maybe you would see less in a very turbid area where the water's moving around a lot.
Okay, it looks like that is our last question for now. If anyone comes up with any last second questions, feel free to go ahead and type those in. But if not, I do want to thank Max again for giving this talk and showing us how phalaropes feed. That was really fun to see. If you think of any questions later, feel free to email those to me, and I am happy to send those to Max. And I'm also just share those with everybody when I send up a follow-up email. So again, thank you so much. Let me know if you have any feedback or questions, and we hope to see you at next week's event. Anything else you want to add, Max?
No, that's everything. Yeah, if you want to learn identifying your 3 Phalarope species and want to get out into the fields this summer and fall, let me know. Hopefully we can get you out there.
All right. Thank you, everybody.